Our guest is Ted Cruz. He's running for the United States Senate from the state of Texas. The last time we had him on, you probably didn't know his name. I'm guessing an increasing number of you do now. Ted, thanks for being with us.
Michael, it's great to be with you.
Well, when you and I first talked, I don't know, 3 to 6 months ago, and you said, I'm running for the United States Senate from the state of Texas. And for those of you not in the state of Texas, trust me, this race is being run across the country. This type of race with these type of characters. Ted Cruz is a political outsider. He does have political experience, but think Marco Rubio in Florida. And I know Ted wants to be his own man, but Marco Rubio was losing 62% to 9% to Charlie Crist. Charlie Crist was supported by the Republican National Committee. He was supported by the same group of people that would bring you Mitt Romney. He had all the money behind him. He was a statewide elected official. And Marco Rubio, the only thing he had behind him, he only had one little bitty tiny thing, and that was the Tea Party. Except that the Tea Party can trump all of that if they get excited. Rubio came from behind 62 to 9 because the more people heard of his story and his message, the more people liked it. And the more people focused on the fact that Charlie Crist's greatest accomplishment was that he'd been a Republican for a long time. That's the same thing John Boehner gave you. Well, Ted Cruz is running in the state of Texas against David Dewhurst, who's the lieutenant governor. David's a very smart guy. He's an extremely wealthy guy. But I don't think anybody would doubt he's an establishment Republican. He's voted against our best interests. He fought the sanctuary cities law. He fought and killed the TSA anti-groping law in the state of Texas that would have really made a strong statement. And Ted, the National Review, we couldn't talk about this the last time you were on, the National Review declared you the great conservative hope. Put him on the front cover of National Review. In fact, I'll link that and post it to my Facebook story. There have been 18 debates where Ted Cruz has challenged the lieutenant governor to debate that were hosted by the Tea Party. The Tea Party folks asked me if I would moderate it. I said, absolutely. And the lieutenant governor won't show up. Why, Ted Cruz?
Well, he believes that he can win this race just by writing a huge check and buying paid TV commercials and radio commercials. And I think that fundamentally disrespects the voters of Texas. At the end of the day, he seems to want to hide from the voters and not answer difficult questions about his record. In the past, he's supported an income tax. He's supported additional spending for the state of Texas. As you pointed out, he killed the Sanctuary Cities bill. He killed the TSA groping bill, and he didn't want to answer those questions. So instead, he just hides up in Austin and plans to write a big check and do a bunch of paid media. And I just think in this time with the Tea Party, with the grassroots, with Republican women, all as energized and active as they ever have been in the history of our country, I don't think anybody is going to succeed in buying this race and hiding from the voters.
Tell folks who all has endorsed you, the big names. I know Dobson last week.
Dr. James Dobson endorsed last week. Across the state of Texas, we have virtually every prominent conservative leader has endorsed us, from Kathy Adams to Kelly Shackelford to George Strait to David Barton to Peggy Venable. And nationally,
she's not a vulnerable, by the way. She's Peggy Venable, but she's not a vulnerable.
Well, and nationally, the four strongest conservatives in the U.S. Senate are Jim DeMint, Mike Lee, Rand Paul, and Pat Toomey. And I'm the only candidate in the country that has the support of all four of them because they need reinforcements. That's what every one of them said when they endorsed, is there are too many squishy establishment Republicans in Washington, and they're outnumbered, and they need the next senator of Texas to have a backbone and be ready to stand up and fight, not just Obama, but the Republicans in our own party that won't stand for basic free market principles in the Constitution.
Mark Levin has endorsed you?
He has indeed.
Who else?
Mark Levin. Ed Meese, President Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, chairs our national leadership team.
You know, I'm looking at tedcruz.com because Scotty Hughes, who books our guest, sent me some new details on your race that I had not seen. And I'll post this, but it's straw poll results, and it says since the race has started, there have been 14 straw polls around the state, and it has you at Greater Houston Council of Republican Women, 63% to 24% for Dewhurst. Northwest Houston Pachyderm, 76% for you, 2% for Dewhurst. Texarkana Tea Party, 54% for you, 1% for Dewhurst. And this was before people knew you had a real chance. East Texas Constitution Alliance, 39% for you, 1% for Dewhurst. Garland Tea Party, 64% for you, 1% for Dewhurst. Kerrville Republican Women, 61% for you, 3% for Dewhurst. 41 to 1, 42 to nothing, 33% to 1, 64%, 45% to nothing, 47% to nothing. You've won every single one of these straw polls.
Well, the pattern we have seen all over the state is that when voters hear our message, they respond powerfully. And our average margin of victory has been over 25 points over every other major candidate. You know, it's interesting. One of the ones you mentioned, Michael, was the Greater Houston Council of Republican Women. And that is the umbrella organization of 40 Republican women's clubs in the 10 counties that surround Houston. And those 10 counties collectively comprise nearly a quarter of the state's population.
What is the Tea Party doing for you? What kind of resources? Because politics have changed in America today. And if you win this race, and I think that's why National Review got involved, the Marco Rubio story, your story, we've seen it with Rand Paul, who nobody believed could beat the establishment Republican there, who had the state party behind him, the national party behind him. Where does the support come from to win a race like this? Because you're running against one of the wealthiest people to ever run for the United States Senate in the state of Texas. I mean, real money.
That's absolutely right. He is expected to put tens of millions of dollars of his own money, just write a check, and just flood the airwaves with ads. And you know the way the game is played. His ads will all pretend he's the most conservative soul to have ever lived. Just the other day he did an interview with a reporter where he said, quote, "We'll have an income tax over my cold, dead body." And it was all you could do to refrain from laughing out loud, because in 2005 he proposed an income tax in the state of Texas. And it's his own record that he doesn't want to answer questions about. And what it's going to take, your question, how do you stand up against that onslaught of money? The answer is the same answer that it was in Florida with Marco Rubio. It's the same answer that it was with Rand Paul in Kentucky, with Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, with Mike Lee in Utah. The answer is the people. It's the grassroots. It's the Tea Party. It's the activists who reach out to their friends, reach out to their families and say, look, we need a strong conservative and a fighter, not another establishment, go along to get along Republican. I mean, that has been destroying Republicans in Washington for a long, long time, as we haven't stood for anything. And 2010 represented a tidal wave where the people said, look, we want people who really believe in the Constitution and have a history and record and the battle scars of standing and fighting for it. And that's what this race is all about.
Ted Cruz, when you first looked at the polling data, you had, 8 to 10 people with Elizabeth Ames Jones, who's dropped out, Roger Williams, who's dropped out to run for Congress, Michael Williams, who I guess has dropped out now.
Yep.
You looked at the former mayor of Dallas, who is a very, very liberal Republican, and then you looked at David Dewhurst, a guy who's never lost an election. He's poured a lot of his own personal wealth into being lieutenant governor. What about the dreadful polling data, which actually interesting is now begun to turn in your favor? What about that data told you, well, we can win this thing?
Well, I think polls are often overrated. At the end of the day, Texans are fundamentally conservative, and I think Texans want a strong conservative and a fighter in the Senate. I know David Dewhurst well. He's a smart man. He's a decent human being. But he's not a conservative, and he's not a fighter. His record has consistently been cutting the baby in half and looking for a compromise. One of the things he has maintained throughout his entire tenure as lieutenant governor is the two-thirds rule, which is a rule in the Senate that says no bill can ever be considered in the Texas Senate without two-thirds of the senators agreeing to take it up, which means necessarily you've got to get a Democrat. And his touchstone has been, let's compromise with the Democrats and not stand for conservative principles. And that has been the problem in Washington over and over again. A big part of the reason Obama got elected is Republicans weren't standing for anything. So I knew in this race there was going to be a need and a desire for a strong conservative alternative to Dewhurst. And we basically had a vigorous sub-primary between me and Michael Williams and Roger Williams and Elizabeth Ames Jones to see who would win that sub-primary. And what happened, as you pointed out, is we saw conservatives and the grassroots and Tea Party leaders unify behind our campaign. We raised over $3 million, and as a result of all of that support coming together, all three of them dropped out. And we now have a clear choice between a strong, proven conservative and a fighter versus an establishment, go-along to get-along Republican. And I think the primary voters are not conflicted when they hear the records of both candidates, when they hear that choice. The reason we're winning by large double-digit margins is Texans want a strong conservative and a fighter.
What did the National Review article where they put you as a candidate, not an office holder, but as a candidate on the front of National Review? I mean, that's the kind of thing that long-standing senators of great note never enjoy, with the headline, First Class Cruz, obviously a play on your last name, C-R-U-Z, Texas Senate candidate Ted Cruz, the next great conservative hope, and a picture of you that's clearly airbrushed because you're not actually that handsome. I mean, what does that do for you?
Well, it is the magic of Hollywood airbrushing. I will give you that. It's tremendously helpful, and it's interesting. The last Senate candidate that National Review put on the cover was Marco Rubio, almost exactly 2 years ago to the day. And when they put Rubio on the cover, he was down 30 points in the polls. And what happened is he continued to unify conservatives both in Florida and nationally. And he ended up not just beating Charlie Crist, who was the incumbent moderate governor in Florida, just like David Dewhurst. He didn't just beat Charlie Crist. He beat him by over 20 points. Because when the voters heard his strong, conservative, optimistic, Reagan-esque message, they knew they didn't want more of the same, of another one of these spineless jellyfish representing us in Washington.
You know, one of the problems we've had, Ted Cruz is our guest. He's a candidate for the United States Senate, and I would argue he will win. Now, the polls right now will tell you that he's not winning, but if you see the movement, he started out way behind, and with an election the first week of March, he is gradually closing that gap, just as what happened with Florida. And a lot of people will pick up the newspaper and read a poll and tell you that that's where things are, but polls are dynamic. They're not static. They're constantly moving, and particularly in a race like this, for those of you who don't know, Kay Bailey Hutchison, long-standing, very liberal Republican, stepping down, and her seat is open. A wide-open Senate seat in the state of Texas for the United States Senate seat is highly, highly coveted. I mean, this seat goes back, Republicans winning this seat in the early 60s with John Tower. I don't know if it was this seat or Cornyn's, but a Republican senator in the state of Texas serving in Washington, D.C., can have an incredible amount of influence. And, you know, a young guy like this, I don't know if it's your goal, but could serve in the Senate long enough to make a real difference. What we've seen with DeMint and Mike Lee and Pat Toomey and Rand Paul is gradually we're getting not just Republicans, but Republicans that do what we want them to do. We're doing away with the old Kay Bailey Hutchison liberal Republicans and getting those folks. Talk for about 45 seconds, because we're out of time, about what they are doing to help you get elected to join their ranks.
Well, as I said, Jim DeMint, Mike Lee, Rand Paul, Pat Toomey, the four strongest conservatives in the Senate, have all enthusiastically endorsed me. Jim DeMint did it the day David Dewhurst announced, to throw down a gauntlet that they need reinforcements. And the reason is simple, Michael. The Senate's at a tipping point. There are 5 or 6 strong conservatives. They're vastly outnumbered. If we can grow that to 10 or 12 strong conservatives in the Senate, we will change the Senate. It will ensure that we address the economic and fiscal crisis in this country, regardless of what happens in the presidential election. And I think Texas should lead the way.